This is the Wise Guy Radio Show, a podcast dedicated to educating and inspiring through conversations with today's top talents in the world of glass. Wesley, welcome to the show.
Hi, how's it going, Jason?
Good, brother. So stoked to have you on here, man. I've been a fan of your work for as long as I've seen it. I don't know, before Instagrams and, I don't know. I'm excited to talk to you. I'm at a loss for words here.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, man. Yeah, so understanding, besides your biography and understanding your journey a little bit that I've from just researching your work and knowing the circles that you've been around, it's interesting seeing the way that the pipe community has grown in the last 20 years, and yourself has also grown within the pipe community because of the art you do and the fandom that I know that is created from your work, from the pipe makers that are just like blown away from the stuff that you do. No pun intended.
Yeah.
So it's intriguing to me to have you on here because I feel like you're a part of our community. For one, this podcast isn't necessarily for the pipe community specifically. I like to cover all glass art, but my focus, because I'm a pipe maker at heart, is the pipe industry, and so
right.
I know your circle is in our community. So
yeah, I appreciate that. I kind of feel myself like there's not necessarily like a sculptural glass community, so I kind of fit between a number of different circles. And I have a lot of friends who are pipe makers, and some of them are pretty well-known pipe makers now, and at one point they were bead makers or whatever,
right.
Or in between, Operation Pipe Dreams, and now they had their little hiatus making, something more in the realm of what I make, and we kind of cross circles a lot more. So
yeah, it's something I definitely want to get into later on for sure, because I feel like as a well-rounded artist, learning how to work solid work and do sculpture is very important to not only as a creative, but also to understanding this material that we're using. Because like we talked pre-show, myself having been a pipe maker for 13 years beforehand, the guy that got me started and introduced me to the torch was a 35-year sculptor, and I met him because he was making these massive dragons, and I was just intrigued watching this guy just creating this incredible detail in this work he was doing. And so the pipes weren't even a thought in my head. I was like, I want to be the next sculptor out there that's doing this kind of stuff he was doing. And he saw my interest in the culture, in the cannabis culture, and I guess in a sense steered me to the pipe culture community in a sense, because I think he also wanted to sell pipes out of his booth at the Renfest. So he maybe saw me as like a guy that can make pipes for him, kind of thing. I'm not really sure, but either way, I feel blessed to have had the opportunity to get started to where I am now, and now that I've learned the sculpture I've learned through Disney, and then translated that into my personal work at home, it's night and day compared to what I was doing. So it's definitely something I want to cover that. But before we get off the tracks here, man, I want to get us rolling here. If you want to get us started by telling us your superhero origin story and how you were introduced to the flame.
All right. Well, I think before I started with glass, I've always been interested in making things with my hands, and I actually come from a multi-generational like road construction family. So I grew up around people, like welding, fixing things, making tools, and it was just a huge emphasis on doing good work and how to make that happen. But I am, I don't know, into smaller things than road construction, I guess.
Yeah.
And I got into jewelry making in high school, and then did that maybe a tiny bit during college. But then I was also studying with a jeweler kind of on the side after college. And we lived in California for a year, And it just happened to, we were in Berkeley on Telegraph Ave, and there was a guy selling his glass beads off a pegboard, just glass beads strung up on hemp.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, what is this? Like, how did he get the color in there and these crazy designs? And I thought, as a jeweler, from a jeweler's perspective, that I could probably figure out how to do that. But then, I didn't have any idea how to go about finding that. But
Right.
then fast forward, my wife is a classical cellist, and we moved to Boston for her to get her master's and doctorate degree. And I found a glassblowing class through the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, and it was like, oh, I have to do this. And she talked her family and my family into like getting together and buying it as a Christmas gift for me, and was like, just that molten glass is so addictive,
Yeah.
dangerous. And I was like, oh, I have to do this, and quit my job and found a crazy guy to intern for and kind of lasted a summer with him. Got out, and then it was like 9/11 happened, September 11th, and it was like finding work was crazy, and I was kind of doing this and that here and there, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of took me a little bit to work my way back to, steady glass work. But I worked for a number of different people, and the last guy that I worked for had this girl come and intern for him, and she was a bead maker. And I was pretty frustrated about not being able to make my own work. I'd like theoretically get exchange time for, at the furnace on the weekend or whatever, but then the pot would be empty or there would be no one to, help me blow glass.
Yeah, that's annoying.
And yeah, so I saw this girl, this guy was friends with Sally Prash, and she came up and set up a torch, and I saw the torch get set up, and I don't know what amount of time it took, but it felt like 5 minutes, and then this girl was sitting there just making work by herself. And I was like, this is my thing. So I, shortly thereafter quit working for him and took a kind of like intro to bead making class just to get the feel for how, you flame work with glass as opposed to furnace work.
Right.
And but I mostly wanted to work sculptural, and so I kind of switched to borosilicate for doing the sculptural stuff because that seemed to be like what you had to do. But boro always felt really frustrating to me, having come from the furnace background and being used to the soft glass. And so then I found out about these guys from Italy, like Lucio Babacco or Vittorio Costantini, who sculpted with soft glass. And I was like, I have to do that. And, I'd already been making insects, and I really wanted to go learn to sculpt soft glass from those guys.
Huh.
So
Fascinating.
yeah, so a friend of mine was kind of organizing workshops over there, but I hadn't been able to kind of get it together to, because it was a decent amount of money to fly over there and take the workshop and everything. But then I found, you might know Lewis Wilson,
Oh
who's
yeah.
one of your compatriots there from Disney. He was getting one of these together, and it was like the price was right and the time was right, and I just like hustled my butt off and sold everything I could to like, make it happen, and went over there for just like a week and a half, and had 3 days each with Lucio Babacco and Vittorio Costantini. But that really gave me the solid foundation for the main set of skills that I use. And then I came back from there and just pretty much practiced what I learned from them for like 2 years before I started branching out on what I do.
Yeah, that's a hell of
So
a trio of, I guess, influence and like masters in a sense to teach you some fundamentals, man. That's incredible. Going back to the jewelry, like were you doing lost wax type stuff?
I did lost wax, but primarily I was doing like fabrication, like using a jeweler's saw, cutting things out, soldering things together.
Okay.
I wasn't working with anything too precious, it was like silver and semi-precious stones, making like pendants and rings and stuff like that.
Using like a small Smith hand torch type thing.
Yeah, well, sometimes they were bigger
Okay.
torches. I didn't ever have my own uh, setup for, I had all the hand tools, but not the whole like, there's like so much more equipment that you need for jewelry making.
Yeah.
It's kind of like woodworking where there are all these different big tools that you need to do it. And so I would like, I would study with someone or I would take a class somewhere so that I could get, uh, you know, so I could learn more things, but also get time with all those tools. Like, when you solder something, you need this whole pickling solution that you throw it in, and then you have to like, you know, file it and burnish it with the burnishing wheel, and you know, just a and just the whole torch setup. Like I lived in apartments in the city, and I couldn't have some big, you know,
Yeah.
torch setup or something.
Well, yeah, I know
So,
what you mean, man. When I started my glass stuff with Gordon was with the Renaissance Festival, and they had friends of theirs that would come in town every year that would basically just like live on their property, and we would go back and forth. But Gordon and I would just load up the back of his van with a couple tanks and our stuff. But they
hmm
had to have a fucking trailer they'd pull behind their car with all their equipment in there. It was just like I was always interested in like the lost wax technique and different types of like ceramic casting and
Yeah,
all kind of stuff like that throughout most of my life. So seeing the differences of the two, I was the same way. I was like, well, man, I could just get a little tiny torch and get a couple tanks and just put it in the back of my car and set up so easily, kind of guerrilla hippie style out in my backyard if I have to, instead of
yeah,
having
for
to have this
sure.
gigantic freaking setup with all this stuff that at any point in time could go awry. It was very interesting, kind of for
Yes.
me giving me directions on as an artist on okay, where am I going to go with this. But even though I immediately
hmm
fell in love with glass, and at the time I knew that was what I was going to do forever. Once I burnt myself for the first time, so I was asking with the lost wax because of the minute details and how small your work is.
Yeah, yeah.
The
I
lost
I
wax
think
is crazy.
like I did a fair bit of lost wax because it was more portable for me, like just the wax carving, and you just need like a little alcohol lamp to like melt to heat your tools to melt it with.
Hmm.
So I did that because I could do that in my apartment or wherever I was living. But I would say like working with the jeweler's saw and just, being able to do fine cutting really helped me with those fine hand skills more than the lost wax would have.
Yeah, it makes sense. Absolutely.
And so just like all the small filing and trying to get everything just right, because also with jewelry, you need to make it look like, it's just one really smooth piece of metal instead of all this stuff that went together.
Right, right.
Uh, you know. So I'd say those really helped me develop those fine hand skills. And also like some of the furnace work that I did, like the last guy I worked for was actually Josh Simpson.
Okay.
He makes these like planet marbles and paperweights and stuff. And so all these marbles that got made were made on the punty. Punty in furnace work is a 5 foot long steel rod. And so the last step in that was, I basically had the lowest job where I had to like run around and pick those up and keep them turning and on center. But then I'd have to like knock off, this like, I don't know, inch and a half to 2 inch marble and fire polish in the punty mark. So it was
Yeah.
like a perfect year. And any of them that I didn't fire polish perfectly would get thrown out. So it was this whole thing where I had to really learn how to like flow, get everything just perfectly hot to get this little punny mark to perfectly flow in. So that I think really helped me with fine detail in the heat as well.
Yeah. So now that I know
So
that, dude, God, Lord have mercy, having like these four guys. Because
yeah,
Josh Simpson's somebody who's myself too. Like I've loved his work forever, and I remember just being younger and seeing those little small planet marbles, and then eventually he starts making those mega planets, and I remember watching the documentary on it, and I'll make sure for those listening, I'll put a link in the show notes if you haven't seen it yet. It's just phenomenal, just the imagination and the fun
yeah.
that he has
I,
with the work.
I don't know if you know this, but his wife is well, she's retired now, but she's an astronaut.
Huh.
So, he's like married to an astronaut, and she's actually taken some of those planets up into space.
That's
And he
incredible.
has this whole infinity project where he sends little marbles to people around the world every month to get hid.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Uh,
yeah, it's fun, right?
so, I think initially it started because he was like, oh, I can't, I want to get my work into museums, but no one would ever take it. So it was like someday, 2,000 years from now, somebody will find one of these and put it in a museum. So, but now, of course, he's in museums all over the
Yeah,
world.
exactly.
So I guess it
Yeah.
worked one way or another.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. So early on in your mindset for the glass, like what was the direction that influenced you to want to get into doing the bugs and
Mm.
insects?
Uh, yeah, so I had switched to flame working. I was always, I grew up with Star Wars and comic books and was always into just weird, crazy animals and things. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to sculpt. Even before I started flame working, I just wanted to make weird, crazy sculptures. But I never got to be talented enough for that at the furnace. But as soon as I started working at the torch, even when I was just making beads for the first year, they always had little tentacles or beaks or weird things sticking off of them as kind of a way to make them sculptural,
Hmm.
and then once I started sculpting with Boro, it was like, what can I make that's weird and interesting? And so I was making just kind of weird, fantastical things, and everybody makes octopi and stuff, but then I was supposed to do a demonstration for a street fair that was happening around this glass shop that I was working and kind of interning at in Boston, and there was a guy there who had shadow boxed insects that he was I think he studied ants for a living, and so while he was out studying ants, he'd collect whatever other interesting insects that he found and then kind of mount them up in these shadow boxes.
Hmm.
And so I saw those at the street fair, and I was like, that would be just perfect in glass, these insects with their hard, shiny bodies. And so that's what I did for my demo. I think I made like an ant or something, and with the Boro, it was kind of like sticking things together, and I probably made some pretty bad welds in the legs
Yeah.
and stuff.
Hmm.
But it was like, it was a big hit, and I think that day I got an order for like six more of whatever I made, and then it was I just got really into the insects. I'd always been interested in insects, but not any more than like snakes or crayfish or, whatever other weird creatures that I found in the woods. But I quickly got into insects, and they were just like perfect for the glass. So,
Yeah, it's fascinating, man. Because like I was showing my wife your work the other day, and she was asking because she's only been on the torch like 4 times, and she's kind of intimidated me on her level of skill on day 4. You know, her going in there because she's like, I'm gonna make a cat today, and I'm like, I told her I was like, you can't make a cat, and then she makes a little kitty cat, kind of thing. So
yeah.
so it's fun because she's also has like a pastry chef background and art background and stuff too.
Oh,
So
yeah.
she's got the hand skills there. So I wasn't surprised, but it was kind of like, okay, I gotta pull the reins back a little bit, because I've had students in the past that were like, as we all were, like day 2 in the blowing glass, you're the best glass blower in the fucking world. So I
Hmm.
got to like knock her down a little bit, even though she's my wife and I love her to death. But anyways, she was asking me, like why isn't he using Boro compared to soft glass? And I was like, well, that's something I'm going to ask him because I'm curious myself, and I understand like trying to pull Boro stringers down, and with the details, say like in a leg where you have a transition going from like black to orange to red kind of thing, and it's just a smooth, clean transition.
Oh,
And in Boro,
whoa.
you really can't achieve that because like the little tips want to ball up and you want to stretch them out, but then it pulls away from the other side of the. It's just such a pain in the ass to do this teeny
Yeah,
tiny detail in Boro. I've tried it myself and I've gotten some small stuff. Like I remember seeing
yeah,
early on some of your wasp that you had made, and I had a guest ask me about making a bee for him on a flower. So I was like, yeah, I can make the bee, but I never did make the legs before because of how tricky it was to make those little legs. So I have like just like the
Yeah.
body of a bee and this little wings, on a flower. Tried doing the legs, man, and it was so difficult. I got like three on one side, and I'm going to do the other side, trying to avoid the flame, and just like the off heat coming off the work was like melting the other legs off.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big part of it is
So
that.
difficult. So for you, is it just like I mean, besides the massive color palette that's available, and for you, is it also because of how that glass just moves seamlessly in a
Yeah,
sense?
I would say like first and foremost, because I started out at the furnace, that's what I was comfortable with
Okay.
because the furnace glass is like 96 COE and the glass I work with is 104.
Hmm.
So they're fairly close together. And they're both soda lime flux as opposed to the boron flux for borosilicate. So they work pretty similarly. Granted, nowadays that I'm so used to the 104, the 96 feels almost like, I don't know, Boro to
A little
me.
stiff.
Yeah, it feels a little stiff. But it was just how it flowed. I was just so used to that, having worked at the furnace for 2 years before I started flame working. And then, starting flame working with the bead making. Boro always just felt so stiff to me, and it's like people out there do amazing stuff with Boro, and I love what people do with it, but I hate working with Boro because it's like I just don't, I'm so used to the small amount of heat that I work with that when I work with Boro, it just is so stiff and it devitrifies, and it's like when I watch people like Salt Lucan
Hmm.
work with Boro, it looks like he's working soft glass
Yeah.
because he works so hot with such a big flame. But it's a very different way of working with the glass. And just to give you an idea, I use about like 1K tank of oxygen a month, and
Wow.
I go through like a barbecue sized propane tank in like 4 months.
Yeah.
So I just work with a much smaller flame, and it's like, if I practiced with the Boro and worked with a bigger flame, I'm sure that I would get the feel for it because, glass is glass, and I know some people who work pretty comfortably with both soft glass and Boro. But I'd say I just, was comfortable to begin with the soft glass, and then yeah, especially when I started flame working, the color palette was extremely limited with Boro and not limited at all with soft glass,
Hmm.
and it was just like what I wanted to do. And then on top of that, at the time I went to Italy to study with Vittorio Costantini, I was still working with borosilicate, but learning this foundation of their techniques, I was just like, I don't want to ever work with the borosilicate
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. I
So
could imagine so.
it's like, when I occasionally I get really fed up with soft glass, just the cracking and exploding of it. Anyone who has never worked with the soft glass, soda lime glass, it cracks and explodes on you like crazy. Like sometimes it can be catastrophic. If you kind of touch it into the flame in the wrong way and it's cooled down, it can explode and shower the whole room with shards of glass.
Yeah. That's why I said
Uh,
pre-show I make a mess when I work with that stuff.
yes.
It's
So
amazing.
it's like occasionally, it's like you put hours of time into something or even days and then it like cracks and you can't necessarily like some things you can go back and repair the way that you can with Boro. But a lot of times when it cracks like that, it's just, you have to start over from scratch.
Hmm.
So occasionally I get fed up with soft glass and I'm like, screw this. And I go get, I have my little stash of Boro and, get on the torch with that. But then it takes me like 2 hours to make something that took me like 10 minutes to make with
Yeah.
soft glass.
Yeah.
And it's all like devitrified and I burn I'm not used to it. So I like burn the colors or boil the cadmiums. And it's like, all right, I'm going back to soft class. So it's like, oh, there are all these people out there who are great with Boro, and more power to them. They can have it.
Right.
I'm
I
sticking with the soft class.
I would love to see though if you ever like took a day and did like a like say like a B and one was Boro and one was soft glass and did like a side by side comparison, like a photograph, something that you post on social media to see if like we could tell which is which, in terms of like the technique. I'm sure we could for the trained eye, but it'd be interesting to see like the layman that doesn't know glass if they would be able to tell the
I think you're
difference.
you're giving me way too much credit there. I think you're talking about like, someone who hasn't worked with glass before, and that's how it would look. It's like I'm better than that because I have all this experience and I have worked Boro off and on here and there, but it would not be a problem to tell the difference between.
It's interesting. So like for myself personally, I was about 15 years in a Boro before I did my first like furnace work, gather and everything, and then I got about
Mhm.
2.5 years roughly under it. And like my main reason for wanting to get into the hot shop, besides helping out at work, but also was to learn how to do like large scale sculptural pieces. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's definitely it's I recommend any Boro worker or flame worker to definitely get some hand skills in a hot shop for sure because there's so much you can
Yes.
learn.
Yeah.
Besides understanding and having appreciation for the amount of heat that comes out of a furnace and the lack of heat that comes off your torch necessarily. But
Yeah.
it was very frustrating because they're trying to, and from what I understand too. So we had this artist Roberta Beltrani or Beltrami. He's out of Murano. He's like right
Mm.
now, I guess he's like the youngest maestro out there in the area. I
Mm.
mean, dude's like early 30s, just super fucking talented. But
Nice.
he was telling us, I guess, like the crystalline structure of our soft glass we were using wasn't really set up for sculpture. It was more for blown glass. I guess because of
Huh.
the way it was a little stiffer, I guess, than what you'd want to use because you go to try to pull with your pincers and you couldn't even hardly grab the glass sometimes because the skin was cooling off
Huh.
too quickly or
Right.
something. So I think that was part of my issue was dealing with that type of glass to try to sculpt with
Mhm.
and then I had some opportunities to do like some bead work and stuff. And what I really found, what I lacked in was understanding the flame properties and what to use
Yes.
for what colors. Because like I would use purples or certain whatever, and they would just turn gray or turn brown on me. I would like basically
Right.
burn in the colors. So that's why I was saying like I'd love to take a class from you. And I think education wise for anybody needs to take classes because then you can learn those specific things like what flame properties you should be using for specific colors and even types of glass because you can't just turn on a Carlisle like I have in my house here and try to melt some Moretti on there. It's not going to work. It's just too
Yeah,
hot.
I've had a hard time when I have tried a Carlisle. Although that said, like Paul Stankard, I believe primarily uses a Carlisle, and he
Yeah.
works with soft glass, like furnace type 96 COE soft glass.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting.
So it is possible. When I have seen him do it, he's mostly working with that premix center fire, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Which makes sense. Yeah, I have to watch one of his videos because like I have a 5-hole Carlisle with the big, a little bit bigger center flame, which I like for pipe making, But I'm sure for the smaller, tiny shit, having like a 3-hole to get that teeny tiny pinpoint flame would be
Okay.
beneficial.
Yeah, I don't even know. Like, I think Carlisle is one of the brand of torches I know the least about. I've seen people work on it. I think one time I took a goblet making lesson from a friend, and he used one, and I don't know. Like I used it, but it's like I don't know, not my torch.
Yeah, it's definitely a workhorse for sure. Comes
Yes.
down to it. What
Well,
do you? Yeah, I know you're using a GTT. Which one are you working on, or from what I've seen?
I have a GTT Phantom, so it's probably a little bigger than what you might think that I'm using, but I rarely ever turn on that outer propane.
Hmm.
But I use all four of the oxygen knobs to help really dial the flame in.
Ah, okay.
And I can even kind of make like a casing of oxygen around the flame so it makes the shoulder of the flame even sharper, like the heat gradient.
Yep.
So it's like, I never know what the actual temperature of the flame is. I've heard like 4 or 5,000 degrees, but I can hold my fingers literally like a half inch on either side of the flame when I'm working to get in very close for doing the detailed work. So because of the high pressures of the gas and the way those torches work, the heat is really going out away from it, and then with a little more oxygen around it, it makes that heat gradient even sharper, so it's a little easier to control that detail.
Right. Yeah, it's like I took a class with Joe Peters and Peter Muller about 5 years ago, and um,
Huh.
watching
Up
Peter's.
at the studio?
It was up at Tea Leaf here, up in Tallahassee here. It's a
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
it's a smoke shop, and they'll bring artists in. Yeah, it was actually I took a class with Steve Sizelove and Coyle did a class together, and then it was a Joe
Yeah.
P. Peter Muller class. But it was I was stoked that it was Joe and Peter just because I know their background and their history together. To see these guys work,
Yeah.
and then Peter being somewhat new to the boreal world too. On top of it, quote unquote new to it. You would never know this guy's
Yeah.
only done boreal work for maybe a decade. You know, but get just
Yeah.
oh go on.
Yeah, he picked it up fast.
Yeah,
But, he
yeah,
was doing furnace work for such a long time and working right around Joe and Coyle and everyone.
yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. But getting to stand behind him and watching him do his little button threads he was doing on one of his voodoo dolls and seeing like that almost invisible flame. I guess he was using a Herbie. Now that I'm thinking about it, and
uh,
but just incredible to see like just how such a sharp, almost invisible flame can create so much specific pinpoint heat to do those kind
yes.
of details. It was
And the
mind-boggling.
nice the nice thing about that sharp gradient to the heat is that you can get in there and do your melting, but then, you can move away from the heat very quickly or move out of that heat zone quickly so that you can keep that detail instead of, if you're, even if you're working on the GTT, but you have the more bushy flame going, you can't do detailed work very near to that.
Yeah.
So occasionally when I'm teaching, the place will have all Nortel miners, and it's like, I can generally do what I'm doing on those, with the detailed work if I really crank the propane down and the oxygen up. But there's just not really a comparison between that little, pinner flame, and like you were saying with Pete using the Herbie or, like Paul Stankard on his CC with that inner fire, if you have the right flame going, you can get that sharp detail and not melt it down.
hmm
But a lot of people are used to those big bushy flames.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then on that being said, dealing with welds and connections, adding a leg to a body, and making sure
Hmm.
everything's symmetrical and clean. And then like the centipede that you just posted recently, having to deal with, it's not a huge piece, but it still has a length to it. So you're dealing with areas potentially cooling down. Are you using like a Bunsen burner at all with that thing, or did you have to like figure out timing and blow up like 100 of them to get it down?
So the way that I work with glass is very different than what most people work, and it's kind of, I don't know, some people would call it the Italian style.
hmm
So I was holding the body of that centipede in my hand while I was putting the leg segments on.
Okay, interesting.
So it was, it had already lost all of its heat. So basically, I work from the thicker parts out, and like with the centipede, I started with the tail, and I put the first segment of each leg on. So there's like a body segment and then the leg segments. So I would create the body segment, put those leg segments on, and then make the next body segment and the first segment of each leg on that. And so as I build up the segments, I'm working my way away from the original starting point,
hmm
and that's coming down. So I would say, almost the entire time I was making the body itself, I was still using the punty to hold it because the tail end was still maybe a couple hundred degrees. But it's really cooled down. I'm not using something to keep it warm. And even if you were using something to keep it warm, like a Bunsen burner, all those little legs would just curl up and melt in the
Right.
flame.
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
So
That's what I was super curious about it.
yeah, so it basically becomes uh, about working with the heat from one end to the other and letting the glass cool down slowly. And because glass is an insulator, it wants to cool at its own rate as long as you're not setting it on something, or like bead makers have the steel mandrel running through it.
Right.
So
Sucking the heat out of it.
I exactly.
Yeah.
So the glass is kind of cooling down as it wants to, but that said, I have to be extremely careful with where any of the waste heat is going from the flame. I have to be careful of the angle that I hold the piece at relative to the flame and not kind of bouncing the flame off of something and hitting the back of it or it would shock. And that's when you get to that point I was talking about earlier where it like catastrophically explodes and then I throw it against the wall and like, I'm gonna work with Boro now.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I actually was making a centipede like a month ago, and I have it sitting on the table in front of me here. And the top end of it is all cracked and it's missing a couple legs in the middle, and it was like just kind of did not want to work with me. So it's there are a lot of pieces that don't work out for all the finished ones that you see. So
Exactly. And no, I do the Great American Teaching for schools. From
hmm
I used to go to my kids' schools, and that was one of the things I told the kids. I was always comparing it to skateboarding. Like you guys didn't see these. You see like Tony Hawk pulling off a 900, but you didn't see the 400 broken bones he had to get to that point to be able to nail that trick. You
yes.
know, so
Yeah, there are a lot of cuts and bruises leading up to that.
yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah, especially with those centipedes, man, because they're not just like a straight stick. You have like this fluidity and natural
yeah,
motion going along with it. So you're even dealing with that, talking about not having any kind of flash of the flame, coming off to the side or anything strange like that.
yeah. Well, and the centipede I was trying to make about a month ago was actually kind of curled around itself, and that was what made it extremely hard.
Hmm.
Was trying to get in there and make the leg segments and not hitting the previous part. And I'd made one of those previously, and I actually made all these tiny miniature marbles, and it was a centipede curled up that was kind of holding its egg clutch. And that previous one had worked out, but this one most certainly did not. So,
Unbelievable. Like even looking at I'm looking at the dragonfly one the photo you sent me of you attaching the wing. Are you using
oh
some
yeah,
sort of press to get the texture into the wings? Like how are you
oh
achieving
yeah.
that?
So those dragonfly wings, I have a pair of pliers called a lineman's plier. It's like an electrician's tool.
Okay.
You go into any hardware store and they should have it, and it's just like a little diamond-shaped texture to it. I would say like now, I've been at this long enough now that I have some nice texturing tools and things that were made by glass people,
Hmm.
or for glass people by tool makers. But generally speaking, I'm kind of like a cheap bastard. So, um, I'd say up until fairly recently, my general tool set was like a cheese knife and some different shaped tweezers that I'd kind of ground on a belt sander to the shape that I wanted, and different pliers I could find in the normal hardware store. So that's most of those textures come from tools like that. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm the
so
same way,
things like
man. I grew up in this industry with the philosophy of the only tools I wanted to use was like my hands and the glass and the torch and a bowl push and maybe a reamer, and just try to
yeah.
be as like Neanderthal as I could. And
Mhm.
it got me through, a decade of work and some success through it. But then once I got to work with the Mouse House, and I'm seeing the artists that
Mhm.
I'm working with, and they're using hand torches. They've got like a toolbox full of tools and like
Yeah.
leather tools for impressions, for textures, and all
Mhm.
kind of stuff. So it was like, well, I've been slowly kind of growing my toolbox in a sense. And
Yeah, I don't disparage using those tools, and I myself have, gathered my toolbox now, so to speak, and I also use a hand torch occasionally, but especially when I teach, I think it's like super important that people's foundation and fundamentals is like with using the least number of tools possible.
hmm
And it's like I don't want to advocate for this person made this tool that you have to have for the class or whatever. It's like I want people to have the feel for the heat in the glass, and also like surface tension of the glass and gravity should be your most fundamental tools. So if you
yep,
can just have at it with some smooth edged thing to carve it, and tweezers to pull at it, and maybe a pair of shears. You should be able to do the vast majority of things with those tools. And then once you kind of have honed your foundation, then I fully advocate expanding your tool set to that toolbox, so to speak.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's like, when I teach glass blowing, I teach it like the whole riding a bike concept of starting off with training wheels, and then eventually,
Mm-hmm.
you get to that point to where you're riding your bike without any hands, after, several years. But it's, in that mindset, I guess you're kind of starting off with tools at first because you have the training wheels there. But
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's just teaching the fundamentals just to get used to making blobs and turning those blobs and eventually into something, and then eventually then adding whatever tools and other things to your skill set. But I think
Right.
through that process for myself, I think the most important tool that I've found so far was my spoon, and being able to, and it has a rounded handle to it, so it makes it easier to kind of twist and turn and manipulate it with it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it's got a nice hard sharp edge to it as well. So doing like curved shapes or moving
Mm.
glass around or digging things out, it's been very
Yeah,
beneficial.
that makes sense. That's cool. I think I've seen a few other people using those, but that's, also kind of like its own paddle and
Hmm.
edge. Yeah, I
Yeah,
guess the
yeah.
cheap knife that I use is curved, so it, can do those curved lines,
Oh,
but
nice. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
amazing what you can do with the simplest tools. And then once you have that foundation, I think before you have that, you don't even necessarily know how to properly use a nicer tool. So,
Yeah, I agree. Like I've got some reamers that I've purchased over the years. I don't even know if
mhm.
it's a reamer. I guess it's like it looks like an isosceles triangle, like paddle kind of situation.
Okay, like those brass things, or
And
is it
it's graphite, but
brass?
it looks like it would be used for like maybe flaring like a lip on a cup or something of that nature. You know, I have no idea because I haven't really figured it out, and I've had it for 20 years. One of these days. But on the same tool thing, I had the other night I was making one of my characters and I'm using my spoon that I do, and he was asking me about the spoon, and he was telling me, we were talking back and forth, that he's a surgeon and works on vertebrae as like his main specialty, and he actually uses a spoon as well. And he was saying that the spoon allows him to, right? Isn't that fucking hilarious, dude? So he was saying, for one, it's like I don't need to spend thousands of dollars on this high tech tool, and if I don't have it, I can just say, hey, go down to the cafeteria and get me a fucking spoon. But two, it allows him to
Yeah,
go in
but
between,
hopefully sanitize it well
right?
somewhere along the
Yeah,
way.
yeah, definitely. But he was saying he's able to get in between vertebrae and separate soft tissue to see and get into like nerve damage issues or things that are pinched, and to actually be able to have a visualization of what it is that he's working on just because of the spoon and the
Wow.
nature of it and the shape of it. Yeah, it's fascinating.
That is amazing to hear, but also pretty scary
Right?
at the same time. I mean, if you think back to like however people, a long time ago used to do surgery and whatever they had, it does make sense,
Yeah.
but it's like, wow, yes.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So another thing I wanted to bring up too was your spring test that you do. So early on for myself, when one of the very first animals I ever made a production for the guy at the Renfest was turtles, and he
Uh-huh.
did a flick test, and the flick test was just flicking the fins on the turtles, and if the fins would pop
Yeah,
off, obviously my weld
yeah,
sucked.
yeah.
And this is also back in the day when it was jade green, which was like the worst green on earth,
Oh,
and the
yeah,
only, you know what I
yeah.
mean. But
Oh, yeah.
so you do the spring test, and I was telling Julie, my wife, about this the other day, and she understood it, but then she didn't, and I had to bring up the little plastic frogs you get when you're a kid when you press their little butt and their little legs spring and they just jump up in the air, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand why you do this, and I look at the shapes and the way that the legs move. So for one,
Mm-hmm.
is this something obviously you do for testing, for strength, for shipping, and for quality of your work? But two, was it inspired from the natural, like, I guess, positioning and the way that bugs actually are, like, because you have such a realism to your work, like the blotchkas.
Yeah,
It reminds me of like the it seems like you have influence from the family just because of the amount of
yes. Yeah,
detail.
I have a huge amount of influence from the Blashkas. I've been to their exhibits like dozens of times, and I know the curator and the conservator there and
Nice.
everything.
Hell
So,
yeah.
um, but no, I would say like it did not doing that test did not come from, anything about how the bugs look. It was just like my really good friends at the Postal Service give me some frustration sometimes.
Hmm.
And especially when I was first starting, it's like, why does this stuff break, and it's like these classes where you're teaching and you said, your teacher flicked off the fin. And I remember, early times, I would tap things and parts would fall off, and it's like, yeah, that isn't gonna make it, and I kind of got to this point where it's like, I've figured out these packaging techniques for, transporting things pretty well. But that said, it's like if it gets the smallest vibration and just falls apart, then it's not ever going to make it through the postal service.
Yeah.
So it's like, I started doing these tests where it's like, and sometimes I'll even, like I think it was in like one of the Bandu Dunham, what's it called? Contemporary lampworking
Yep.
books.
Yep.
And it might have been a quote from him or maybe from Mylan Townsend about like tapping your piece with the tweezers. And if it doesn't ring, then there's a crack in it.
Huh.
And, um, I think it might have been partly inspired by that and, just really checking my pieces out. And I have like a little jeweler's loop that I use. I think it's like a 10 times magnification. And with some of the pieces where I can't tell, if you look at those welds really close, like from the normal human eye, it might look like a nice, sharp, acute angle. But then, if it's really a good connection and you get in there with the magnification and look at it, it's really a smooth curve. So
Yeah.
if it doesn't have those really good welds and those smooth curves, if you try and bounce it, the foot or the leg's just going to pop off, and that might be annoying, and you might have to remake part of it, but it's way better than it getting to a customer and being broken. And, not to say I don't still have breakages, but I've gotten my breakage rates down well under 5%.
Nice.
So pretty happy with that. And I still get them, and if it breaks coming to someone, then I pay for, reimburse them for return shipping and repair it and get it back to them. Because it's like, you were talking about functional glass. It's like the things that I make don't have any function other than, an emotional purpose for
Hmm.
someone. So if it arrives to them broken, that emotional purpose is broken, and, I don't want to lose that customer, so I'd
Yeah.
rather keep them happy. And if I can break the piece before I send it out and repair it, that saves me that shipping round right there.
Yeah, yeah. So that being said, man, so early on in your career, like, as you're learning this process, like, how were you going about selling your work?
Okay, I would, first I was selling through craft fairs, selling directly to people that I knew. Anytime I went to a conference, like, you know, I would have stuff in my, I make small things, so I found little cases that I could put individual pieces in. And my friends would always be laughing at me, like, what else do you have in your pockets? Like, I'd just be like slinging stuff out of my pockets. So I'd go to a conference and I'd have my backpack on and I'd have like a little pistol case full of my work, and just like slinging it. And, it was like you were talking about Joe Peters and Pete Muller, and they're friends of mine, and they used to do all the big circuit craft shows.
Hmm.
And actually the last real craft show I did was the Smithsonian Craft Show, and I was up there, talking to them because it's like they did all these big shows, like, give me your advice on what to do. And Joe's like, yeah, you're gonna have your little blanket out and set your stuff down and, just be sitting there on the ground slinging your stuff out of your pockets. Like,
That's hilarious.
that was my style, It was like I did some, smaller local craft shows, but a lot of it I just like sling on the side because, other class people loved my stuff. So I sold a lot that way, you know,
Yeah.
and it would always pay for like whatever conference I went to. Um, but then, you know, like selling online really worked well for me too, because I've always been into photography my whole life. Like I started out with a little 110 camera when I was little. Like those had the little weird roll of film in them that was like if you don't even know what it was, I can't describe it, but it was like the cheapo starter camera. But
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like
I know
I,
what you're talking about.
and I got into like developing my own film and everything. So it's like I'm good with photography, and you know, I actually am very good with computers because I was always into those, and I made my living for a while doing web development.
Nice.
Uh, so it was like a natural fit for me to sell online. So I started doing that as soon as possible and sold a little through eBay and some other, you know, Facebook and other places. But you know, Etsy's worked out pretty well for me.
Yeah.
Uh, so that was kind of what I worked towards. Also, once I did that show at the Smithsonian, it really like doing big shows like that. I don't know if people haven't done them, it's like an insane expenditure to do those shows, like the booth fees, you know, and you have to like advertise in the pamphlet and stay in a hotel and either rent or buy all the show equipment. And I literally spent $10,000 doing that show. And, you know, I did a little better than break even, but it was just like, this is not my thing, you know, and you have to like stop selling work for long enough beforehand to store work up to
Yeah.
sell at it. And, you know, it's just like the stress of that was killing me. So it's, you know, I've been just selling online
Heck yeah.
since then,
Nice.
and that's pretty good.
Yeah, especially now with once this whole pandemic thing started, you know, and everything went virtually, it seems
Yeah,
you're kind of set up for that already.
yeah, I mean, it was amazing for me, knock on wood, you know, and it's been kind of a killer to the people who are making their living selling at those craft shows because it's like that whole thing just completely fell in its face for a while. So, and it's also like I think that whole scene had kind of been dying down a little bit, and you know, there are always a lot of people at those shows with more production kind of stuff anyways, and maybe even some importy stuff that they weren't saying was imports. So it will be interesting to see how this changes, you know, things for that whole craft scene.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Have you had any issues with yourself having things knocked off?
Mm, Not that I know of, you know. It's like the amount of time and work that goes in. I mean, there are some people like there's someone on Etsy that I see like from the Ukraine that, you know, has made a few things that look like they're inspired by mine, but they're not made nearly as well. But making, you know, good work, you know, that's going to hold together and looks good enough,
Hmm.
it is pretty hard to knock off. You know, I think there are like a couple other people that I see that are, you know, have come up in the last few years and are making really good insects as well. But it's like, you know, like you were talking about the Blauschkas, like I certainly didn't invent glass insects, so it's not my, I don't have ownership of that, so to speak, you
Right,
know?
right, right.
It's like I make things inspired, you know, by pictures I see or other things. So it's like I couldn't say that someone else who's making an insect, you know, that looks similar to mine is like knocking me off, so to speak. There are a few things I've made where it's like, you know, I definitely made this stylistic piece, and you know, if someone made that, it would be a knockoff, you know. But yeah, I've been fortunate in that regard. I don't think to be knocked off, but it's, you know, making good quality work, I think, is also a hard thing to knock off. And if you're good enough to get to that level, I think you're not necessarily going to knock things off, if you
Hmm.
know what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always find too, like those that are concerned about getting knocked off and by imports or whatever. It's like
Yeah,
there's a certain market that is for that you are are within, and you have a certain customer base, and the customers know you, and if you're if you understand that, then you don't have to worry about what else is going on out there. Because
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like if if you're a pipe maker that only makes little $20 spoons and you feel like people in India are knocking you off, I think you're in the wrong business. Or if
hmm
you're a bead maker that's getting your beads, making, spacer beads or whatever, and you feel like people are knocking off your style, it's like, how many bead makers are there in the world, you know? So if
yeah,
you want to develop your own style and just the amount of time and work that goes into it, um, I think if other people can get to that level, maybe they'd knock you off, but probably the amount of work they put in themselves, they're gonna want to do their own thing, you know?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. By the way, have you had a chance to see the new Netflix show called Life in Color?
Life in Color. Oh, the new David Attenborough.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think I just saw one or two of those episodes. My wife was watching one the other night.
yeah. I watched
There,
episode 1 last night, man. It's incredible.
which one was that? Was that the Birds of Paradise?
Yeah. Wasn't that shit
Yeah.
crazy?
Yeah. Yeah, there's another show that's not David Attenborough that is only about those crazy birds
hmm
of paradise. Some other British show. We watched that on Netflix a few weeks ago. But
Huh.
yeah, I'd say the Life on Earth, I think, was what the first David Attenborough series
Yeah,
was.
that sounds right.
And that
Yep.
had huge inspiration to me. Like that's where I learned about cordyceps, which is like the psychotropic mind control fungus that's like specific to different insects.
Yeah, stuff's
And
crazy, right?
all of them erupts from their body, and I was like, oh my God, I have to make that in glass. Yeah. So that was a huge inspiration for
I
me.
wonder how many people wake up and see something like that and then say, "I gotta make that in glass."
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
I know. I love it, dude. Because like I'm the same way. Like there's so many things that I've seen. Like I remember like when I was first doing like filicellos or even just like the radicello pattern and trying to really
Mhm.
figure that out. Like the quote unquote fakecellos I was making. I was
Uh-huh.
noticing patterns in everything, like from car tire
Yes,
rims to pine cones and just nature in general. And it was just
everywhere.
yeah, it's amazing. Like once you focus on something, how just it unlocks your brain to realize what else is out there and that same kind of
Yeah.
thing.
And it's like the universe goes as small as you want to imagine it or as large as you want to imagine it. Those patterns are there at every size we can imagine, and it's like we're just such a tiny part of that universe. It's
Yeah.
kind of hilarious.
Well, and on that same note, like that's one of my favorite things about working within Disney and being a guest and going there is like I love going on the rides and everything else, but I love nothing more than looking at the ground or the walls and seeing all these little minute details that most people
Mm.
that go there completely miss it.
Hmm.
Well, I had an octopus I made for a guest like 2 weeks ago, and it had a small crack in it, and was like one of those cracks that's like in the middle of the glass, kind of thing. And it was right at the base of the octopus body where the tentacles are all attached to it and stuff. And
Huh?
I use like the that really tiny center flame that you can get for the in the on the GTT to like dig into the glass and like get cracks and stuff out with it. And
Mm.
I'm wondering if he's calling me back about that because I thought I got it all fixed and everything, but I don't know.
Yeah, those hidden cracks. And that's something like I was talking about earlier, like I've heard about that with Boro.
Yeah,
Do that with soft glass, you're either gonna wind up with shards everywhere or it's just gonna melt everything down. So it's like, yeah, I hear about this crack fixing thing, but
yeah, exactly. Give me one. I'm just trying to send him a text real quick. Okay. Yeah, I guess in soft glass, you're really not going to be able to dig in there and, or even like waste your time, I guess, because you can just start over. If it's taking you 10 minutes to make something, then what's the point?
yeah. Well, with some of the things I make that have a lot of components I pre-made, and it gets to that point where something cracks, like, I'll probably be much more likely to try to go in and repair it.
hmm
But then if that fails, because I've put all these components into it, a lot of times I can probably rip off a lot of the components, and it takes a lot of time to do that, but it's a lot less time than, it probably took me to make those.
Yeah, yeah, I could imagine, and that's actually a great transition to what I was going to ask you next. And I don't want to like have you give away all your secrets, but just again, for I do this podcast for my own selfish reasons, and then I just share my selfishness with the rest of the world. So as far
Yeah.
as knowledge goes, so understanding like assembly of a piece, and like I'm looking at
Yeah.
this praying mantis that you have, right? So understanding that with boro we can rest things in the kiln, let them cool down, reheat them, etc. I've seen
Hmm.
like Raven Sky River that does like these massive turtles, and he's got a pre-made shell, and
Yeah.
that's in a kiln waiting for him to stick a head to it, type of thing.
Hmm.
Are you doing similar things? Are you you're pre-building like segments of the body? Are you pre-building like with the praying mantis, like its front mandible claw things that they
Yeah.
have? You know.
I would say pre-made isn't quite the right word. Like with the mantis, like for some things, yes, I'm definitely pre-making a lot of components that then I put together later.
Hmm.
But using the mantis as a specific example, I actually make the body first, um, and then it has the first segment of all the legs, which is this thin connection point that I can come back to later when the piece is cooled down. And actually, I'll usually anneal the body before I go back and put the legs on. Uh, but I do that first, and then I make the claw segments, and then I'll put those on. I think there was a little while where I was pre-making the claw segments before I would do the body, so I have them ready to stick right on, and I'd pre-make the head as well. But the problem with that is, you make those first, and I have much better control of the size of the claws or the head than I do when I'm making the body, kind of, going with the flow and the heat and
Hmm.
everything. So basically, I make the body first so that I have the size for that, and then I will, I guess, post make the claws, and meanwhile I will have annealed the body. But then I have this thin connection point, so I have the first segment, I guess you might say the bicep
Okay.
of those claws done, and then I just have the elbow as the connection point, and because that's only somewhere between maybe 1 to 2 millimeters or maybe 3 millimeters at the thickest, I can come back to that, and occasionally I'll have some cracking issues, but the vast majority of the time I can heat that connection point up without a problem, as long as I'm careful where the rest of the piece is relative to the
Okay.
flame.
Yep.
And then I can put that on, and then I'll make the head and put that on, so I can get the expression just right with where things go.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense to me, at least.
Yeah,
Hope.
but I would like to say, like, I've been making more flowers
Hmm.
lately, and so with those, I have to pre-make all the petals and the leaves, and so then I'll get all those components pre-made, and then I start with the stem or the base of the flower petal, and then start putting those together. And then I'm also using bridging so that if something cracks while I'm putting things together, I can come in there and hopefully fix the crack without having things fall apart. The bridging holds things
Yep.
in place,
Yeah.
and then, you know, put things together. And then sometimes things might even crack once they're all together. I have to be very careful. With the soft glass, the coefficient of expansion is so much higher than with the borosilicate. So if the bridges aren't thin enough and long enough, they can actually put a little too much tension on a part that you've already done as a new part is coming down, and it might flex that and make it crack.
Interesting.
So it's this whole thing, like sometimes depending on the shape of something, I have to take some of the bridges off as I go, or I'll do all these crazy long thin bridges. And yeah, it's something I'm kind of still figuring out, but bridging is kind of a life changer with all of that.
Yeah, man. I
And that
I
was
agree.
something that I learned that from watching Salt work,
Uh huh.
big pipe making demo,
Right,
and it's like,
and I was the same way, like with taking that coil class, like watching those guys bridge everything, and I was always worried about like I mean going back to like seeing people like completely coat this massive I remember back there was a video I saw of Yu Sheen making one of his giant push bubblers back in the day, like early on in the
Uh-huh.
community, and he just like goes back in the flame and just coats it with all this, all the carbon and stuff, and then
Mm-hmm.
works his pieces, and I remember seeing that and early on and trying that and having like catastrophic issues by doing that, and a lot of it was either my kiln wasn't hot enough or it wasn't certain things weren't just kind of clean, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of my thing. I stayed away from for a long time. I now do that a lot more so because I'm a lot more confident. But then the bridging came in. Excuse me. And the bridging came in, and the bridging was the same way. Like I was always nervous about like a bridge popping or it just being just like knocking off my blowpipe or something like that. And just within like, so I would say probably the last year and a half, I
Uh-huh.
do a ton of bridging. Like I've got an octopus in my kiln right now that's got probably 30 bridges on it right now, and it's
Uh-huh.
and everything's clean. I have no cracks, no issues at all. Every once in a while, you get a bridge that pops, and it's like the scariest sound in the whole world when it's in your kiln.
Oh yeah.
It's the worst. But it's yeah, it's definitely a game changer, and then having to go back and clean them up. But it's amazing what you can do and the amount of cleanliness that you get by allowing yourself to be comfortable bridging. And
Yes, bridging, but doing good welds even on the
yeah.
bridges because that's where some of those issues can come from. But yeah, it's a whole tricky thing in and of itself, and those crazy sounds.
Oh man, and the bridge seems like it's those cracks are like louder than any other cracks that happen. It's crazy.
Yeah, because they're connected to
Yeah.
everything.
And like you're saying that I didn't think about the soft glass and that tension that it's creating. So you're even getting a louder pop because of that springiness tension that's happening.
Yeah, yeah, and that can be the frustrating thing when it's like the work that I'm doing or even the bridges make a crack happen. So
Hmm. Yeah,
it's
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 fast. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I'm glad you shared that, like the process, because like I see going back to the octopus when I was taught the production side of making octopus, it was
uh,
making the body without turning the head back yet, just having it like a almost like a butt plug, basically the shape of the body,
uh,
and then building the legs onto the actual octopus. And I
uh,
know a lot of people that do that are in the pipe community, but also in sculpture, they actually will pre-build the tentacles and then attach them. And I've always found by building the tentacle onto the body, it just gives it a lot better flow of the movement and more of a natural look to the shape of and proportions too.
do you mean pre-making the tentacle or you mean making it right off
Making
the
it, yeah,
body?
making it right on the body. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that I would have to agree with that, and I think that was one of my early arguments against pre-making components. But then you kind of get to a point with some things where it's like you do have to pre-make
Hmm.
things or post-make things and stick them on because you just can't get that level of detail. But
Right, like the flowers,
with
for instance.
exactly. But I find, like you were saying, the lifelikeness of the insects that I make, it's like if I try not to pre-make any components at all if I can help it, because otherwise, they just kind of wind up in these stiff, stilted, weird kind of
Hmm.
positions, as opposed to making it as you go. And it's like this, one leg is kind of coming off at this weird angle, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll make this one go off slightly more at this angle and then it'll look like it's walking, or
Exactly.
as opposed to standing still. So you can kind of work with the awkwardness instead of be controlled by it.
Yeah, and it gives it that movement and an animated look to the piece, even though it's a static sculpture. It still has like, I mean, looking at this picture of this wasp on your hand, like this thing just landed on your finger and it's about to fly away. It's awesome. Like it's how it should be. Eventually,
Yeah,
obviously early on learning this kind of stuff, it's gonna look stiff and whatever. But after lots and lots of practice, you eventually find that natural flow because nature is nature and it's never gonna change. It's always flowing and
no.
changing and moving and
Yeah, and nothing's ever perfect with nature.
exactly.
If you look at a plant, it's always, got bites out of it, or some, beetle you find might be missing a leg, or
Hmm. Do you actually like study specifically study the thing you're making?
I do. I have studied quite a lot. I don't have an entomology degree or anything, but I do know entomologists at different local colleges, so I can go and look at their collections. I watch a lot of videos on the internet to see how the insects move,
Hmm.
as they walk or just even as they move their antennae around. But I spend a huge amount of time in the woods. I grew up running around in the woods, and so it's like I find a lot of bugs, and I'll keep them for a day. I don't ever like keeping anything more than that because I seem to be exceptionally good at not being good at taking care of things. And I remember like sometime when I was little and I caught a snake and I had it in a coffee can or something, and then it's like sat in the sun and unfortunately got killed by the
Oh
sun.
man, yeah.
And I think after that specific incident, it's like I never keep anything, for very long so that I'm sure I can, release it safely back into the wild. But we have these awesome millipedes up here where I live that get to be like 4 inches or longer
Wow.
and almost as thick as your pinky. And I love catching those and letting them crawl on my arm and, beetles and even some spiders. So,
Heck yeah. Yeah, your spiders, man. Like that's what some of my favorite things that you do. Like I love all of it, but seeing like the
thank
spider
you.
collection. Yeah, you're welcome. And seeing I like that you use the coin to give size reference. Like I remember back we used
Yes.
to use like a lighter to give a reference for pipes, but
Uh-huh.
using that coin because it really gives you like the idea of like, oh my god, this.
Yeah, everybody knows what size that
Yeah.
is. And, when I was first taking pictures, I'd take a picture and post it, and people just kind of assumed it was like a foot long because of the details. And so having that tiny reference really helps. And for actually a good number of years there, I was always taking the picture on my finger or my thumb so you could really see, relative to a person what size they were. But then a year ago, I kind of stopped doing that because people seem to be uncomfortable with, that my hand might have been on it, which is also kind of funny because it's like I did hand make
Right.
this.
The irony.
But I don't want people to be any more scared of COVID than they currently
All
are,
right.
so I went back. And also, I can't tell you like you're talking about the bounce test, right? And I usually do that from like an inch or two up. But when I'm trying to like balance a piece on my finger and take a picture of it with my other hand, I have occasionally dropped them and broken them that
Oh
way.
man.
And so I've been kind of happy not using my own hand as a model for the slide. It's made it a lot quicker and easier to photograph my work for selling it. So yeah, the dime comes in handy. And it's funny, I have a friend who, when I need a video done, will come over and help me with that. And he's like, "Oh, it's the famous dime."
That's hilarious.
Like the dime in my photo setup
Yeah.
that was like with every picture. I used to try to have like the current year's dime in the picture, but then that got to be tedious. So now it's just like this dime that's been in every picture I've taken of my work for the past however many years.
Nice. Hell yeah, that's awesome. I love it. Well, I think, man, it's a good spot for us to take a quick break and thank some sponsors, and then we'll,
All
we'll come
right.
back and it'll be time for us to crash the kiln. This segment is brought to you by the supporters of our Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to early releases of podcast episodes, monthly coaching calls, video tutorials, and more. The first 20 artists to sign up and join our founders group will have lifetime access to online courses, coaching calls, and much, much more. If you'd like to support the show while growing as an artist, head over to our community at patreon.com/wiseguyradio or use the link in the show notes and sign up today. That's patreon.com/wiseguyradio. That's WYZGUY radio. All right, so we are back. It's time for us to crash the kiln. Crash the kiln consists of 7 questions. If you want to give me a 30 to 60-second answer, but you can also expound upon them as most guests typically do. And the first question I always like to ask is if there's any living glass artist that you haven't worked or collabed with yet, and you want to, who is it and why?
I would say Janice Miltenberger. She works with Boro and not soft glass. Uh, But I would say she makes such interesting and conceptual work that I've always been inspired by pretty much everything that I see her make. And so I'd love to kind of work with her and see that process.
Heck yeah. I am not familiar, but I'm looking her up right now. Oh,
Wow,
oh
definitely.
yeah. Holy
Look,
shit.
she's a OG.
Yeah, now that I'm seeing the work, I'm familiar with the work for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah, I'm always. That's why I love this industry, man. It's like there's so much hidden talent out there.
Can I tell you one other name?
Yeah.
You know Carmen
Oh
Lozar?
yeah.
She does amazing conceptual work as well.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I remember when she revealed one of her first pipes that she ever made, and everybody was like having a blast because it was such a different concept, like you're saying, just like out of the box idea for and how a pipe should look like.
actually, she made. I went to the last Glass Art Society conference at
Hmm.
Corning. She made a pipe for that demo because that was like the year that Salt demoed there,
Okay.
and she's like, I'm gonna make a pipe. Except her pipe was not like a smoking out of pipe. It was a bubble blowing pipe.
Hilarious. I love that.
She made a functional pipe, but it was not that type of function. So
That's hilarious.
yeah.
Oh man, that's great. So a lot of people listening to this are probably not familiar with what you're about to say, but what are your top five favorite colors in glass?
Yeah, because I work with soft glass, soda lime glass. These are not the general industry standard Boro
Yeah.
colors. I mostly work with the brand Affitre, formerly known as Moretti, but then it was bought out by three guys whose last name started with F, hence F.A. Tre, the Italian way to say three F's.
Hilarious.
Yeah, so black would be my main. I'd use black in almost everything I do. It's very across the board insecty color. Chestnut brown is another favorite, good for insects. And then, I've been getting into plants lately. So grass green, pea green, and another one I really like is butter yellow.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
people might not be familiar, but
Yeah. We have similar
those are
similar colors, I guess, in the Boro palette. At least when we do now.
you do now. You have more than cobalt and turbo cobalt, and
Amber purple. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when Blue Moon and Amber Purples first came out, and it was just like, oh, this stuff is awesome. And I still
yeah.
use it 21 years later.
Mm.
Yeah. What is excuse me. I hope I'm not getting starting to get symptoms from this vaccine shot.
Yeah, I hope you're not going to get me sick. Everybody on the podcast jumps for the floor when they hear you cough. So.
What's your worst injury in the studio?
Hmm. I would say my worst injury in the studio happened when I was still working at the furnace and I grabbed a blowpipe by the wrong end and
Oh,
got a nice horizontal burn all the way across my one hand.
oh,
But then I'd say in my glass blowing studio, I moved, I don't know what, 11 years ago now. And I was just exhausted from all the packing and everything, and I was trying to like burn out the propane tank before I had it bouncing around in the back of a moving truck, driving two-thirds of the way across the country. And so I'd been burning it out, and then it kind of looked like it was out, and I stupidly, for some reason in my mind, was like, "Oh, I'll put my hand in front of the flame and make sure it's not still going." And it was down to this like little pinner flame, but it was still cranking out the heat, so I got a nice big burn on the palm of my
oh
hand
man.
while I still had to pack up and carry boxes and everything. Yeah. My wife was pretty pissed at me about
Oh, I could
that.
imagine
So
so.
yeah,
Yeah, it's incredible getting kissed by a torch. Like how instantly it just tears you up.
yeah, it's bad. I would say though, when I was little, I picked up a fire poker by the wrong end,
Mm.
and that taught me to be respectful of hot things pretty well. So I'd say, knock on wood again, I'd probably burn myself less than a lot of glass people do. But then I would also say on the flip side of that, a lot of the times when I get burned is when I'm teaching and, newer students set the hot end of things down where you don't expect it to
Yep,
be.
I did that about a month and a half ago. I know what you mean.
Yeah. Like, why didn't you set it down away from you?
Yeah. So one of my bad habits in my glass world is I leave one end of my rods sharp, so I always know that that end has never been in the flame, kind of thing.
Mm,
Because I've had
yeah,
like I
yeah.
picked up rods that like my fingers stuck to it, and I left fingerprints behind, kind of stuff.
Ugh.
So, and I make sure my students know, like, this is a terrible habit. Do not do this. But while you're in my classes, this is how you're going to work, kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
And what happened with me is my student was just put two. One of my first lessons is building rods and taking little
Hmm.
scraps and making them, 2 into 1 and 4 into 2, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And just one of those welds was just still hot, and I didn't even think about,
Yeah.
and just picked it up.
I still do that as a daily practice. Like I said earlier, I'm a cheap bastard. I don't like wasting things, so I always put the little bit on the end of a new rod, and I've definitely done that occasionally. Pick it up with a
Yeah,
hot spot.
I'm the same way, man. That's how I start my day off every time I turn a torch on. I always recycle the day's work from before.
It's really great for heat, learning the heat control in the
Yeah.
glass. If you can make it look almost like there's no weld there, then you've really got your heat control down.
Yeah, exactly. I teach it for that reason. I teach it to teach what center means and how when it's not perfectly straight, when that connection's not right, how because I may then have them take that and make a little marble on the end so they can see the difference between it being perfectly straight and then being off center, and how
Yeah,
it
you can
happens.
make it that way.
Yeah, yeah, it's fun. It's a fun little lesson.
Hmm.
So next question is: when you're in the shop, do you watch TV, listen to the radio, or do you do both?
I listen to music. If I'm doing something like packaging, something that doesn't take that much of my focus, then maybe I'll listen to some podcasts or the radio. But I actually have a number of playlists that I just listen to over and over and over because it's like I like listening to music while I'm working, but if there's anything new on, it kind of takes my focus
Mm-hmm.
away. And like when I'm doing all this work where I need to be absolutely careful of where any of the waste heat glancing off the piece goes, like, and I'm slightly distracted, then things don't go well. So I unfortunately listen to a lot of not new music, but
It makes sense though,
it
man.
works.
Like you have to have the
Yeah.
the ultimate focus for what you do, for sure. I'm sure it's exhausting.
Yeah. I actually would say like sometimes it's exhausting when I'm kind of making something that's a little more frustrating or uh, that I'm not used to making, but it's actually much more of a Zen thing for me.
Hmm.
Kind of my meditative thing. And like my wife would tell you, when I haven't been in my studio making glass for a while, I get kind of testy. So it, I would say it's the opposite of stressful for me most of the time.
Nice. Yeah, mine would say the same thing. She's
Mhm.
yeah, because I'm the same way, man. Like I got to a point where I was going up a flight of stairs like years ago, and I was like, why am I so out of breath? Like I wasn't like overweight and out of. I mean, I was out of shape, but I wasn't like overweight and anything. And I realized it's because of that same thing. Like I'm getting this rhythmic, shallow breathing in the process of what I'm doing, and because it is so
Yeah.
meditative. So I just started doing like
Hmm.
jump rope exercises and get my cardio up because of it.
Nice. I go up the mountain for
Yeah, I'm in the Sunshine State, so there's Space Mountain's the only
that.
mountain I'm going up anytime soon.
In the roller coaster,
Yeah,
so that'll get your heart rate up though,
yeah,
right?
that's true.
That's not bad.
That's so funny. If you could describe the sound of glass cracking, whether it's a physical sound that it makes or an emotional response that it gives you, what would it be?
I would say release, not always in
Interesting.
a good way, but
Huh.
release of stress. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Pop.
how I educate my guests, dude. About like they ask what the kilns are for, and I tell them that like the concept of the memory the glass has and the stress that it is, and I'm like, if you were like glass and you held on to all that stress, eventually you're gonna crack too.
Yeah, it's like the kiln is like the weekend, If you don't get your weekend or your day off every now and then, you're just gonna, fall apart.
Yep.
So,
Hell yeah. You're the first person to say that, and I love that. That's a great thing. Steve Seislove, he's got another one that said it's the art of learning how not to attach yourself basically to things and letting go.
mm, I working with glass is definitely that, and also becoming okay with things breaking.
Yeah. Oh man, I talk about it all the time, dude. Like the lessons that we learn that just translate into everyday situations. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's incredible. Next question is, do you have any glass blowing themed tattoos?
I have no tattoos,
Awesome.
so answer to that is no.
Hell yeah. That's always a good answer. I always appreciate that. And last but not least is, what are your top 5 favorite tools? And that does not include your torch, your kiln, or your glasses.
When I read that question, I was like, "Oh, my torch is my top favorite one." But I guess if we're not gonna say that, my next would be my cheese knife, just a little cheese knife that I do my carving and shaping with. Then I would say non-serrated tweezers. I have several. I keep different tweezers on either side of me that are non-serrated, and I have them ground to different shapes for different types of grabbing or
Hmm.
shaping or pulling of the glass or moving glass. But that way, there's always one close to either hand. I'd say after that, I have a brass shaping thing, kind of like the stump shaper, just like a little brass shaping tool that is really nice. It's probably kind of like your spoon.
Okay.
It's also really good for taking the heat out of things and helping to get control of them, which is not an issue you have with Boro, but with soft glass, sometimes you need things to be less hot
Yeah.
so they don't like fall.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I would say two huge tools that I use are surface tension and gravity. The surface tension of the glass as it wants to kind of pull back together for rounding things out, and also gravity for stretching things out or keeping, helping get things to go where you want to go.
Hell yeah. You're the first person in 300 episodes plus to say gravity. Gravity is one of my favorite tools.
Yeah, man. It's
Yeah, I
like
love it.
gravity is, a lot of people feel like they're fighting against it, but it's like you're also working with
Yeah,
it. So,
absolutely.
and when you're making a gather, you're using those two things, surface tension and gravity, to make the gather.
Yep.
So,
And again, that's why I teach the blob after building rods, so they understand where gravity comes in certain angles and pitches, and how to change it.
hmm
You get a mushroom shape. Well, you just pitch your elbow up a little bit and change the rod settings,
yeah.
and it's amazing.
I'd say my final favorite tool would be my serrated tweezers, just like, tweezers with the little teeth in the ends.
Hmm.
And those are great for putting a pattern in the wings of something or for, you know, also grabbing glass that just doesn't want to be grabbed very well. But I mostly use them for texturing.
Nice. Yeah, I use them for fin textures for fish. Same thing.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. Great answers. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Hell yeah. Well, before we let you go here, and again, I'll do a little outro, and then we'll say our byes off the air here. But before we let you go, if you could give us a little parting piece of advice, and that could be life advice or glass advice or whatever. And then after that, a
Mm.
little where we can find you out there in cyberspace.
I would say with glass and life, just take it one step at a time. It's like you can't accomplish everything at once, and otherwise you just get frustrated.
Yeah.
And take it easy on yourself too. I think that's been a huge lesson for me in this past year with the pandemic and the shutdown. Is like sometimes the world or glass or whatever is just going to do what it's going to do, and you have to go with the flow, because otherwise you're fighting against something you absolutely can't fight against.
Yeah, exactly. Oh,
But
yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. I'd say those have been my biggest lessons in this past year. Is just also like, trying to appreciate myself better and take it easier on myself, and just appreciate life, and like we were talking about with the kiln, take a day off and take a step back from things and get away from things, and I also get out into nature if you can. It's amazing for inspiration and also just calming yourself. So
Yeah.
it's what I do. I go climb up the mountain at least once a week.
Heck yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, man, the whole idea, I guess they call it like forest bathing or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so important. So important. Yeah, our bodies are our main tool that we use, and we got to make sure we take care of them. And in your situation, making super teeny tiny things, I guess there's one more question for you. are you finding that you're having any like hand or like carpal tunnel issues or wrist issues or cramping at all because of like just how small you have to work?
Yeah, I've figured out things over time, like with different size punties and whatnot to use. So I don't have so much of an issue with carpal tunnel, and also I don't do as much kind of repetitive
Hmm.
things. But I have had a lot of neck issues, and so like I go to a chiropractor once a month, and I've really worked on trying to figure out better ergonomics, so maybe a little more behind my torch instead of leaning down over it. Or for a while, I was kind of turning the torch sideways to get a better view.
Yeah.
And, neck issues, I would say, have been my big issue. I have wrist rests at my torch to kind of help take some of the stress off my arms from holding them up if I'm doing detailed work for a really long
Nice.
time. But yeah, it's super important to really, work on your ergonomic setup so that you're not hurting yourself. Because if you want to do this for your life, you don't want to ruin your body.
Yeah, completely, man. And I'm asking because like I can always tell throughout the months what I've worked on based on how I feel. And like most of the time
Mm.
I'm standing when I'm making bigger character pieces or stuff that isn't as detailed, but there's times where I make these little small eagles on a branch and building out the feathers on the wings, and I'm building them on the body itself, so they're not like individually, I'm not making them
Uh-huh.
components. So I'm the same way. Like I'm like using that tiny center flame on the GTT and really building up the feathers, but I'm in this fucked up arched over position that I feel it in my
Mm.
neck and my lower back and in my shoulders
Yeah,
more than anything.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's good to be able to change. Like I have my workbench height at the height where I can work either standing or sitting. I have like a drafting height
Yep.
chair. And, if I'm doing bigger things where I move around more, I'll usually stand. And then if I'm doing things where I'm really in the same position for a long time, doing tiny work, I sit. And I think it was, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, I was trying to make some mantis claws and I just did it all standing up. And those are like super fine detail work. And I just like effed up my neck. And it was like out of whack for at least a couple weeks. And it was, because I had worked doing something tiny standing up and as opposed to sitting down.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's really good, if you hurt yourself working, like think about, what made that happen and what can you do differently.
Yeah, exactly. Hell yeah. Well said. All right, man. So,
Public service,
what was that?
public service announcement.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, I found too, in resting my elbows on hard surfaces for long periods of times is one of the worst things you could
Yeah,
do for your body because of that
yeah, yeah.
that tendon that's in your elbow. It just jacks you up.
Yeah, so I have these wrist rests. It's called the Creation Station. I don't know if they still make it, but they kind of move around different ways. And it came with elbow rests, but I took those off, so I don't use those. But having something to rest my wrist on really takes the tension off my shoulder, and then I'm not having to like rest my elbow on the table either. So it's not really hitting your tendons.
Yeah, yeah. We had one of those little setups at our studio over in Epcot. One of the ladies that was working with us at one point in time was doing bead work in there, and she had that for that same reason, just for doing tiny beads and just holding their elbows up. It was an
Yeah,
interesting setup. I'd never seen it before until I saw her using it, and I was like, "What the hell is that?" I thought it was like a TV tray or
yeah.
something. Put your food on for watching the boob tube or
Yeah,
something.
it was like the first time I saw one, I think what like I mine looks differently than the ones that they were making when they were, and I heard they maybe quit making them, but the instant I saw a picture of one of those and a video of someone using them, and I was like, that is a game changer for me. So I got it, but I never liked the elbow rest. They were just like in the way.
Yeah, yeah. That's very strange. Hell yeah. Well, go ahead and hang on, man. I'll say goodbye off the air for you. Do a little outro here. So hope. Oh, you know what? One more question, man. Sorry. Where did Metropod come from?
Okay, Vetropod. So I studied Italian for like 6 months before I went over to Italy to learn from Lucio and Vittorio. I knew that Lucio spoke some English, but I knew Vittorio didn't speak any, and I wanted to be able to learn from him in his language. And so, I went took these Italian classes, and vetro is the word for glass in
Mm-hmm.
Italian. And then a word like the Latin word or the taxonomic word for insects and other hard-bodied creatures is arthropod. So vetropod is kind of a mashup of arthropod and vetro, so like vetropod.
Hell yeah.
It was kind of a clever thing, but I was at this period where I was like trying to figure out like a Etsy name and a domain name and Instagram handle, and like, finding a word that is not taken was like impossible. And so I was like, trying to come up with all these things, and it's like, a word that I made up that no one was using, but also kind of applied itself to what I make, and also the language of the style of glassworking that I do.
Well,
So
yeah, and that's what it seems to me like. It's you've created like a definition or like a classification for the specific work that you make.
yeah, I guess it's
Fascinating.
been nice.
Yeah, I was trying to figure it out, man, because it's very witty, and I like witty stuff, and I'm like trying to break it down, and I knew the Vetra with the glass in Italian, but I didn't put two and two together until. So I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and some people think it's like, the pot. I don't know. People come up with all kind of inventions for
Yeah.
it, but the thing is, it's like short, easy to remember, and fairly easy to spell. So
Well, it's also fascinating to me because, like, again, growing up in the pipe community and you being in that circle as well, we all had to have some kind of AKA, anonymous name,
handle.
back in the day,
Yeah,
So it kind of was just like it was very fitting, which also then just kind of tied you right back into our community. So
yeah.
it's a full circle thing. It's I love it. Super cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, man. Hell yeah. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode with Wesley. Definitely look for him out there on Instagram under Vetropod. I'll have all the links in the show notes for his work website, his Etsy's, everything else. Definitely check out his work. Super inspirational. And I'd love to see you all out there trying to make your own little tiny detailed bugs in Boro, for that matter. But try soft glass, and it's definitely worth the headaches in the end. But until next time, take care of yourself. Stay hydrated out there. Happy melting, and have a wise day.